We now come to the backbench debate on services for people with autism. I call on Hugh Merriman to move. Hugh Merriman.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this House notes that World Autism Awareness Week runs from the 1st of April to the 7th of April, observes that autistic people continue to face a number of barriers to full participation in society, notes that it is 10 years since the Autism Act became law, and calls on the Government to improve support for children and adults on the autism spectrum and ensure that the Autism Act is fully implemented across the country. Mr Deputy Speaker, every year the Right Honourable Member for Chesham and Amersham moves this motion in her role as Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Autism. She cannot be with us today. She has asked me to explain that a close family member is critically ill and she cannot leave their side. Mr Deputy Speaker, through you, can I send the love of this House to James Cheryl? She is a formidable champion of this cause and someone who many of us have turned to in our own hours of need. The best tribute I can pay to her is to deliver the speech which she had prepared and would have given from this place. These are her words. I welcome the Minister to the front bench and look forward to hearing what she has to say. My thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate as we look forward to World Autism Awareness Week, a full 7 days where people across the UK take part in activities to raise awareness of autism. I also thank the National Autistic Society for their ongoing support for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism. Honourable members will be aware of my long-standing commitment to improving the lives of people on the autism spectrum, most notably through my role in spearheading the introduction of the Autism Act 2009, which has now been on the statute book for 10 years. I was proud to introduce the bill that became the Autism Act, which is the only act dedicated to improving support and services for one disability. It was a landmark in the battle to improve the lives of autistic adults and their families. As a result of the Act, there has been a fundamental shift in how policy is developed and delivered for adults on the autism spectrum. For the first time, legal duties were placed on councils and the NHS to provide support to autistic adults in their local areas. In addition, the Act placed the responsibility on the Government to produce a national autism strategy setting out its vision and, importantly, to keep that strategy under review.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Of course, give way.
Like him, I'd like to pay huge tribute to our right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham, and all that she has done on this issue for so long. And I listened carefully to my honourable friend's excellent speech, but I wonder what he would say to a constituent who wrote to me talking about her son in his early 20s, and she writes to say, since leaving education, he has nothing to do. He's not disabled enough to qualify for any benefits, but he's not able to compete for a job. He is caught in the middle. What more does my honourable friend think we can do to help people like that young man with his future?
I thank my honourable friend for his words and also for highlighting and championing the constituents that, as he rightly says, tend to actually fall through the gaps. And of course, there is a review and a responsibility on all authorities to actually take note when it comes to autism. So therefore, when it takes, I think when we see individuals who are on the spectrum but are not receiving the help because they may be outside of a defined period, the extension of plans up to the age of 25 helps to go some way, but we still see these measures fall. I will touch on some of the other areas that it may, I hope, address his concerns, or at least calls that I'll make to the front bench. Because this year it falls on the Government to once again review its strategy and identify what more needs to be done. Each of us, as my honourable member has just reminded, has around 1,000 people on the autism spectrum in our constituencies, and it affects 1 in 100 people. We each will have many autistic people and their family members contacting us to ask for our help on areas from education to adult support, diagnosis to employment. I give way.
Yeah, thank you. Can I thank the member for the excellent speech he's making? He makes a point about the government strategy and looking at the issue. Part of the problem, which is also a perennial problem that keeps cropping up every time, certainly in my constituency, is one is the speed of diagnosis, but also the fact is that so many children with autism just do not get an education. Yeah. That strategy has surely got to try and address that in a much better way than it has in the past.
The honourable member is absolutely right, and one of the issues we see time and time again is that young people have to fail in order to be given the service and support that they actually need. There are good examples of young people going to a preschool where it's quite clearly failed. They still then have to go on to a mainstream school where they will then fail before they are then given that support. It should have been blindingly obvious, and councils should actually look at those plans before the primary school starts. They should do that, and often many will say they're not required. Perhaps they don't actually know what their obligations really are. I give way first to the Honourable Lady and then to the Honourable Gentleman.
The Honourable Member, who's indeed making an excellent speech, he has also referred to parents. And could I just ask him his view about how much the needs of parents and family members should also be part of this strategy, not least because sometimes not even understanding what the experience of their children and how they can best help, but also the needs of the family sometimes to get respite because of the needs of the children with autism, and also to recognise the work of many schools and specialist schools doing amazing work on making sure that children with autism, who have got amazing talents as well, have the ability to have that expressed and developed in their schools.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and I was very proud a couple of years ago to be a co-author of the Education in Autism report that she worked on as well. And that did show many worrying statistics, that sort of one in two teachers just didn't have the confidence to be able to teach autistic children. Unsurprisingly, 50% of autistic children found that they had a miserable time at school and weren't being looked at. She's absolutely right to pay credit to the parents, because they are on an incredible journey and struggle themselves, and for them to battle for the support they need at the same time as actually providing the care, the emotional drain, is incredible, and we all work with these parents and have so much respect for them. I just give way to the Honourable Gentleman, and then I'll take a couple more interventions and make progress.
Very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way and also achieving this debate, and also, of course, to the Right Honourable Member for Cheshire and Amersham for all of the work that she's done on this point. And he makes some very, very important points. But does not share with me the annoyance that, unfortunately, autism seems to be one of those invisible disabilities, and so many parents talk about how others judge particularly their children as just being naughty. And this failure of understanding goes to the very heart of the problem that autistic children and adults face. Their contribution to our communities are enormous, individual and highly important, and that we should be able to open our eyes to all the strengths that autistic children and adults bring to us, and in that way make a space for them to be understood through the services that the Honourable Member is talking about at the moment.
The Honourable Member puts it beautifully, and he will probably also be aware that a recent survey showed that 50% of autistic individuals and families were scared to go out, didn't go out, because they were worried in the way that they would be judged. And that isolation is a huge challenge for us. I'll take two more briefly, and then I will make some progress. Honourable Lady.
I thank him for giving way. I'm really pleased that we have this debate today in the main chamber, and it follows on to the very moving debate we had actually in Westminster Hall some months ago, because this is such an important issue that we need to raise here. And I'm really sorry that I have to leave, unfortunately, because this debate was meant to start about an hour ago, at least that's how it was in my diary. I'm so sorry not to be with you, but I'm so pleased that you're raising the issue now. Now, in my local authority, there are some excellent care providers...
Just tell the Honourable Lady, I don't know who's given you that time, because somebody must have misled you. There was no set time for this to start. Vera Hobhouse.
I apologise. Anyway, in my local authorities, there are some excellent care providers and support services, including Bain's Parent Carers Voice, which support parents and who are caring for children, and they are such important organisations. But does he agree that services for children with autism should be financed as part of a local council budget rather than pushing these responsibility onto struggling families?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point. I think that we are all seeing a real challenge, because as local authorities are themselves having to look at their budgets, then some of the altruistic services, the support services, are ones that tend to go. And the challenge I have is that as local authorities look just at their statutory obligations, they could end up spending more money to deliver those than some of the support services beforehand. So I have every sympathy with the point she makes. Lastly, I give way.
Can I pay my own tribute to the Right Honourable Lady and say he's doing a very good job of reading her speech. I mean, the biggest frustration I find from parents is when a care plan has been agreed and in place, and then the local authority comes back and tries to renegotiate the sum of money that's been agreed downwards. That causes problems to the parents, it causes problems obviously to the person who's got autism, but also to the particularly specialist units providing it. Would you agree that that is unfair and the wrong way to go about this whole problem?
I certainly would. I think the challenge with care plans is to make sure that they're flexible enough so they can be built on. But also there needs to be some form of prescription there so that there's a proper guide as well. But what they shouldn't be is actually reneged on effectively, where actually the care and support is still needed. So he makes that point very, very forcibly. He also makes the point that I'm doing a good job reading the speech. I'll carry on doing my best. I was talking about the service areas where it impacts. I mentioned education to adult support, diagnosis to employment, transition to transport. We know the many ways that an autistic person may turn to the state and to us, as we've just stated, for support, and how vital it is to make sure it is there to meet their needs. The last national strategy, Think Autism, in 2014, included wide-ranging actions. This was underpinned with revised statutory guidance, setting out clear duties on councils and the NHS to deliver on these actions. But we know that many local areas are not meeting all of their obligations. There are also questions about whether the Act goes far enough. As we reach the 10th anniversary of the Act, now is an appropriate time to ask these questions. The APPG on Autism, which I am proud to chair, is spending this year doing just that. We are holding an inquiry into what has worked, what happened now, and most importantly, what needs to change. We are looking very broadly to reflect the needs of autistic people, and these will include health and mental health, children, education and transition, employment, access to justice, adult support and public understanding. I'll give way one more time.
Very grateful, and I very much welcome the inquiry that the APPG is holding, and in particular that they'll be looking at the way that adults with autism interact with the criminal justice system, because I think this is an area where absolutely the work of previous acts could be extended. And can I just pay tribute to the families who set up an organisation called autisminjustice.org and recommend to other members and people watching our debate who are interested in how autism and the criminal justice system interact to have a look at their website.
I thank the honourable member. I certainly remember going on a trip with the All-Party Parliamentary Group in Autism to it's a Young Offenders Institute. It talks about adults in prisons, but that was where they'd actually tried to put a wing together that was autistic friendly, and they were hoping to roll that out across the estate. But I think he's absolutely right. There is a big cohort of the prison population that are on the spectrum with particular challenges that need to be looked at. I will give way one more time. I really should make some progress.
The honourable member mentioned the issue about employment as well, and this is an area that is vastly underlooked because many employers aren't aware about what adjustments they need to make themselves more autism friendly, therefore depriving people with autism with work. Is that something the inquiry will be looking at?
It indeed has, and there was a big report a few years back by Ambitious about autism that looked specifically at this. I myself had a constituent. I'm fortunate enough to have an organisation called Littlegate Farm that take people from the end of their education, gets them work ready. But it requires employers to give them a chance. So I always write to employers, urging them to do so. I'll give you one example. There was one young lad who was obsessed with washing cars. And as a result, we matched him up with a garage, and that's exactly what he does. We've got somebody else who we've got in a bookkeepers, and the big challenge then is actually making sure that young person actually takes time off because they're just used to that routine the whole time. So it's actually become so successful that they're throwing themselves into work. So we must do everything we can as members here to try and pair and support. So he's absolutely right. I continue. As the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, we will hold the government's feet to the fire to see these recommendations reflected in the new strategy. Our need to act is clear. Too many people, as we've just discussed, still have to wait too long for a diagnosis. More than 3 years in some parts of the country. Getting a diagnosis can be a crucial milestone, helping to unlock vital support. Delays in being diagnosed can result in people developing more significant needs or mental health problems. National guidance from the health watchdog NICE state clearly that a child or adult suspected of being on the autism spectrum should start their diagnostic assessment within 3 months of being referred to their local autism team. But we know there is a postcode lottery in waiting times for appointments, with many parts of the country falling far short of the 3-month target. Alongside the National Autistic Society, we have been pushing progress on this issue in this very chamber for several years. Valuable research carried out by the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk on behalf of the APPGA shone a further spotlight on these long waits and called for a mandatory minimum waiting time standard. I am pleased to have him on board again leading our inquiry on health and mental health, which heard evidence just last week. We also know that autistic people too often don't get the physical and mental health care they need. They face high levels of health inequality, and evidence suggests that people may die early as a result. And this has been highlighted by the organisation Autistica. It's vital that all health and care staff receive autism training to ensure that our health service meets their needs and makes the changes and adjustments that it needs to, a key part of the Autism Act. I welcome the Government's current proposals on mandatory training in autism and learning disability to all health and care staff following the dogged campaigning of Paula McGowan, a mother who tragically lost her son Oliver. It is vital that this proposal is taken forward and that its impact is monitored, and I hope the Minister will devote some time to make sure that this programme makes a real difference. I also welcome the inclusion of autism alongside learning disability as one of the four clinical priorities in the NHS 10-year plan to improve health services. This is a great step towards ensuring that the NHS supports autistic people as well as it supports everybody else. It sets out actions to reduce children's diagnosis waiting times, reduce the number of autistic people inappropriately under section in mental health hospitals, and making sure that reasonable adjustments are put in place. But we need more detail on how these and other commitments in the plan will be delivered and how they will be funded. I would appreciate if the Minister could update the House on when we can expect to see this much needed detail. I am pleased to see the Government already thinking ambitiously about the future of the strategy. I warmly welcome the Government's commitment to extending the autism strategy to include children and young people, as well as adults, for the very first time. I give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, who's making an exceptionally powerful speech, and I applaud his role as chairman of the all-party group. And it's particularly impressive that he's been able to pick up my right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham's role in this debate in her absence. Could I just take him back to education? He touched on young people a moment ago. Does he agree with me that the government's recent announcement of an additional 37 schools right across the country to provide special needs support for people, including those on the autistic spectrum, is a very welcome recognition of the challenges presented to our education system by the increasing prevalence, regrettably, of autism across our communities. And I'd like to highlight one in particular in my constituency, which points out the need for a pattern of these schools, to wit, a mother with two autistic children, both of whom have to be schooled over 100 miles away from Ludlow, in the heart of my constituency where she lives. And she has campaigned with a local charity and not-for-profit group to open a new school which is currently awaiting its Ofsted accreditation, Overton School, just outside Ludlow, partly so that other families who have to deal with the same circumstances will not have to travel 100 miles to visit their children.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know how much he campaigns to deliver the solution he talked about, because I'm fortunate enough to share an office with him. So he's such a champion of his constituents. But it is welcome news that there will be more schools to be funded, and I think that the Minister will have heard his powerful pitch for his constituency. I can reassure all members that I'm only temporarily sitting in for the right honourable member for Chesham Amersham. She will indeed continue to be the chairman. I will progress because I know that others wish to take time. For many families of autistic children, securing the right support for their child at school is a very difficult task, much harder than it should be. I'm sure we have all been contacted by constituents who are struggling to get the school provision and support their autistic children need. This may be at a place of specialist school or support to enable them to thrive and make progress in a mainstream school. There's one other very important issue that I wanted to draw the attention of the House and the Minister, and that is the continued inclusion of autism in the Mental Health Act as a mental disorder. What this means is that autistic people and people with a learning disability, particularly those who have behaviour that is described as challenging, can be detained under the Act when they do not have a treatable mental illness. When this is twinned with a lack of appropriate support, particularly crisis support, to prevent someone being admitted to hospital, we can see the numbers of autistic people in these hospitals increase. And I would like to see the Government address this particular challenge and issue. Mr Deputy Speaker, I will conclude. I have failed to deliver the entire speech from my right honourable friend, but she would be delighted that we've had a debate about it and raised the awareness instead. So I finish on this note. Autistic people, children and adults, need the right support at the right time in their local communities. The wider community needs to have a much better understanding of what autism is and how it affects people. There are things that all of us can do to make our society a more inclusive place for everyone. In World Autism Awareness Week and beyond, this should be our goal.
Can I just say, lots of members, so a 6-minute limit. And what I would like to say is our thoughts are with Dame Cheryl, and she has been missed today, but she's certainly been well represented. Would like to do now with a 6-minute limit is come over that the question is on the order paper. Hang on, Deborah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's certainly a pleasure and an honour to follow both the Honourable Member for Bexhill in battle, but also sort of in spirit, the Right Honourable Lady for Cheshire and Amersham, who we truly salute today and all of this year, the 10th anniversary of the Act. I know both he and she will agree with me that there's still a lot to be done, and I'm proud to be one of the APPG Autism's officers chairing one of the commissions marking that anniversary and measuring progress. The one I'm chairing is on autism, and that's the subject of my remarks today. I'd particularly also like to thank my staff, Mike Davis and Ravina Shah, who lead for me on autism, but also the work of the National Autistic Society, particularly our regional rep, Henry, and the Bristol Autism Spectrum Service. And according to a recent report by the National Autistic Society, only 16% of working-age people with autism are in full-time employment. Only 32% with autism are in any kind of paid employment. And this contrasts with the fact that 47% of working-age disabled people, I'm going to try and stick to the time limit, are in employment. And in contrast, 80% of working-age people, I'm so sorry, just a lot of people want to speak, without disabilities are in employment. The 2017 Tory manifesto pledged to see 1 million more disabled people in work by 2027. However, I'm not sure that the government is currently measuring the employment gap for people with autism, so I asked the Minister if she's able to record the number of autistic people in work in the labour force survey, and if not, whether some progress can be made. More than 500,000 people in the UK are on the spectrum, and that's more than 1% of the population, more and more people being diagnosed, and a 25-fold increase in recent years. But people often, though not always, need specific help to be able to find and keep a job. So I asked the Minister to urge the Job Centre Plus to provide adequate training on autism awareness. The National Autistic Society's campaign Too Much Information, launched in 2016, was the UK's biggest ever campaign aimed at improving public understanding of autism, and that campaign's report found that 77% of unemployed autistic people want to work, but also 40% who are currently working part-time wish to work more hours. People with autism want to work in a wide variety of roles, and respondents to that survey find that ideal work environments vary hugely, from the arts and museum work to scientific research and development, and we really need to break stereotypes about autism and employment and recognise that it's also the underemployment of people with autism as an issue, as well as unemployment. And more needs to be done to improve the lives of people living with autism. I've changed my own employment practices by altering job descriptions to be more accessible, and I'm very proud of the 2 fantastic members of staff I've employed as a result. They're brilliant. But I was also the first MP, I believe, to hold a surgery specifically for people on the autism spectrum, and I know others have followed suit, which is fantastic, and no doubt done a better job. But I'm committed to making Bristol an autism-friendly city, and I made that commitment when I was first elected. Because my constituents tell me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that many people on the autistic spectrum find barriers to finding employment, and it's right that we do everything we can to end social isolation, but one way of doing this is to make sure that autistic people have the same access to employment as everybody else. Employers, trade unions, public services can all play a part in this, because unfortunately this exclusion then leads not only to them feeling left out, but also to us missing out on their skills and qualities. They have potential which is too often untapped. It's also their families and wider economy. So we want to make sure, I think here today, we should all pledge to doing everything we can to increasing the employment of people on the spectrum. But employers say they feel under-equipped. And the National Autistic Society survey said that 60% worry about getting it wrong and do not know where to go for support and advice on this. So as an officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, chairing that commission on employment of people with autism, I want to involve people with autism, and I will be involving people with autism, but there will also be discussions for us there about how, the practical measures for how we get people with autism into employment in ways that make sense and fit their potential, but do not discriminate. And I'll continue to campaign for Bristol to become a truly autism-friendly city. I'm delighted that so many of Bristol's employers are so keen to join me in achieving this goal. I spoke recently to many employers over the last year or so about this, and every single one that I've met has taken on various steps to make their employment practices more accessible. So can I ask the Minister what the government will do in turn to help close that autism employment gap? And if she isn't able to answer that today, whether she'll perhaps consider coming to our Commission inquiry to discuss that further. So finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to thank all those people on the autistic spectrum who have not just inspired me, but helped me, taught me, challenged me frequently how I as a politician and as an employer can do better. Autism is in my family, Madam Deputy Speaker, and my autistic teenager nephew is doing really well, and he has so much to offer, many talents, but he is going to need employers to understand his autism, and that may in turn mean that they need help. So I want every one of us here to take that away from today, the need to help employers to do better to close the autism employment gap. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my South West colleague, the member for Bristol West, in this important debate. The National Autistic Society says that around 700,000 people are on the autism spectrum in the UK, more than 1 in 100. This means that autism is part of daily life for around 2.8 million people when you include their families. Therefore, I welcome this debate on services for people with autism, and I'd like to raise 2 specific points in my contribution today. At my surgery last week, I had the pleasure of meeting a chap called Tigger Pritchard, who's the Cornwall National Autistic Society champion. Tigger is running a great campaign to make Bodmin in North Cornwall the first autistic town in Cornwall, following an example set by the town in Aylesbury in my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster's constituency. Tigger has been sending letters to businesses in Bodmin telling them of the opportunities that they can have to help people with autism and their families become less socially isolated. If shops were to have a period of time during the day where they turn their music down or off, dim their lights, reduced till noise, and develop staff knowledge on autism, people on the autism spectrum would have more access to those services. Tigger has had a great response from businesses in Bodmin in the weeks coming into April, which means National Awareness Month. My team and I will be meeting with them again so we can learn a bit more about autism. Should Bodmin manage to become an autism-friendly town, I hope this will inspire many other communities in Cornwall, as well as across the UK, to become more autism-friendly. Madam Deputy Speaker, the second issue I'd like to raise is the inquiry into the detention of young people with learning difficulties, which is being undertaken by the Joint Committee on Human Rights, of which I'm a member. Following the 2011 Winterbourne abuse scandal, the Department for Health and Social Care policy response Transforming Care declared that hospitals were not where people should be living. The Transforming Care policy regrettably missed the target to move those inappropriately placed in hospital or mental health care to community-based support no later than the 1st of June 2014. I welcome the renewal of the government's efforts to ensure that people with autism are not inappropriately placed in hospital care, and the NHS England's efforts to ensure that similar scandals don't happen again. On the 9th of January, the committee heard evidence for its inquiry from the Deputy Chief Inspector of Hospitals and the Care Quality Commission, the NHS England's National Director for Learning Disabilities, and its current National Clinical Director for Learning Difficulties. My view is we need to improve diagnosis and help as quick as we possibly can, and I welcome the new approach that NHS England has brought in to complaints procedure called Ask, Listen, Do. Ask, Listen, Do allows feedback from people with autism and their families to be given and received by organisations easier and provide opportunities to improve the experiences of people with autism. But there's still more work to do, and this is a long-standing problem for families and carers being excluded from care decisions, as we've heard from my honourable friend from Bexhill. and not given the appropriate information. Moreover, according to the data from the Assured Transformation collection, while by the end of October 2018 the number of people in learning disabilities and autism inpatient settings was down from March 2015, the number of under 18s in these settings have more than doubled to 250. I would encourage people to submit written evidence to the inquiry so we can explore how and where we can improve services for those on the autism spectrum. And can I lastly take this opportunity to encourage all of my colleagues in this House to use National Autism Awareness Day on the 2nd of April to learn more about autism and encourage change in their communities to better accommodate people who are on the autism spectrum and their families. Tigger has kindly offered to come into my office and give us a training session for half an hour in Cornwall so that my office can be much more autism aware, and I hope other colleagues will take that opportunity too.
Stephen Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from North Cornwall and to congratulate the honourable gentleman from Bexhill and Battle for opening today's debate, and I join him in paying tribute to the fantastic work of the Right Honourable Lady from Chesham and Amersham, and join others in sending our very best wishes to her and her family today. I want to focus on children with autism. We know that from the outset families face an uphill struggle to obtain the help and support that they deserve. And I pay tribute to the work of a relatively new organisation in Liverpool, Autism in Motion, which seeks to provide a voice for parents. It was set up by 3 Liverpool mums of children on the autistic spectrum. National guidelines state that people should start their diagnostic assessment within 3 months of being referred to the autism team. But we know from statistics obtained last year by the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk that there is a postcode lottery in waiting times for an initial appointment, with many parts of the country falling woefully short of the 3-month target, and in some parts of the country it can take years to receive a diagnosis of autism. Of course, I give way. Yes.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way on that point, and I wonder if he agrees with me that it would be most helpful to many families who, and indeed professionals who are challenged by these circumstances, if the government were able to put more resources specifically into teacher training, initial teacher training, and into in-service training to help staff in schools better understand autism and to better support children with autistic spectrum issues.
Hear, hear.
I thank my honourable friend. I think he makes an excellent point, and I'm going to refer briefly later in my speech to Abbotsleigh Special School in Liverpool, which I think is a shining example of some of the very best practice that does exist in our education system. Delays in diagnosing autism mean that many autistic people don't receive the support that they need, and that can really harm their life chances. For too many families, securing the right support for their child at school is a hugely difficult task, and it can become an all-consuming battle. The passport to receiving this extra support is the Education Healthcare Plan, intended to bring together the different needs in education, health and social care. We know that autism is the most common type of special need for those school pupils who have an EHC plan, but as budgets have been reduced, local councils are often struggling to respond to demand, leading to these plans being refused or delayed well beyond the 20-week cut-off date by which a decision whether to approve a plan should be made. I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he's making a very important point. Would he accept my experience, and I suspect others, is that because of the delays in getting an assessment made, some parents are having to pay up to £2,000 or £3,000 out of their own pocket because they can't afford to wait that long for their children to be assessed.
My honourable friend makes a very important point. It's one of the many aspects of this challenge that makes life very difficult for the families of children with autism, and we really need to do better by them. Even those families who do get a plan often find that they're not given the support that they need. I know that the APPG in its report showed that only 1 in 10 parents were very satisfied with the process of agreeing a plan for their child, with 60% saying they were dissatisfied. in Liverpool, the recent Ofsted inspection into how the City Council and the Clinical Commissioning Group cater for children with special education needs and disabilities found significant concerns and long-standing issues in local practice. And in particular, the inspection found serious weaknesses in the EHC planning process, as well as the quality of the plans that were made. In response to these concerns, the City Council is required to submit a written statement of action explaining how Liverpool will tackle the areas of significant weakness identified. I'm pleased that the City Council is responding with the urgency that this report demands. They have responded positively, but we know that Liverpool is far from being in a unique situation here. In fact, a majority, over 50%, of the SEND area inspections so far have resulted in the requirement of a statement of written action. This is a huge national challenge. Now, across the country, we've seen often devastating cuts in local government funding, and this has contributed to a crisis in funding for children with SEND. Councils often struggling to meet their statutory duties for children with autism. We know from Freedom of Information data and from councils' own reports that councils are overspending massively. Overspending on SEND has trebled in the last 3 years. It's continuing to increase, with councils having to raid millions from their overall schools budgets to respond to demand, and cuts to local authority budgets have also further reduced the kind of support that used to be in place for social activities for children with autism and additional support for their families. Despite this challenging environment, there are brilliant examples across the country of great support for autistic children and their families. And in Liverpool, we have some truly outstanding special schools. It's not just me saying that. Ofsted says they're truly outstanding, including 3 in my constituency, Redbridge, Bankview and Ernest Cookson, which serve children with autism. I want to focus on Abbotsleigh School, which is in fact in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Garston and Hale Wood. Abbotsleigh caters for over 250 students from age 3 to 19, and its philosophy of education is the ASD model. The head teacher told me this week that she focuses equally on academic progress, specialist therapeutic support and the development of life skills. And I pay tribute to Anya Hildre, the head of that school. She's transformed its curriculum, and she says that she unapologetically aspires to be the best special school in the world. Like so many other specialist schools, Abbotsleigh is being held back from being able to provide the very best, partly because local government funding doesn't go far enough to meet the demand for specialist placements or mainstream support. Anya told me this week that some of the key reforms, welcome reforms, in the Children and Families Act of 2014 haven't been implemented as planned, leading to poor school planning and often a lack of joint commissioning. Delays in autism diagnosis will often mean that schools are getting their referrals much later than they would have wished, and as a result, this limits the ability of the school to help to transform the lives of the children in the school. Like other special schools, Abbotsleigh is keen to engage both locally and nationally with government and the local authority to help shape the future provision of education for children and young people with autism. And I urge the Minister and her colleagues in the Department for Education to listen and engage with the concerns of brilliant head teachers like Anya and of families in Liverpool and elsewhere to work on a cross-government basis to improve outcomes for children with autism. There is an urgent need to improve the quality of services provided to children, young people and their families. This can only be done, firstly, with the proper resourcing that I've spoken about, but also by ensuring that the barriers that still exist between our health system on the one hand and our education system on the other are broken down. And if we're truly going to make the progress that I think on a cross-party basis we all want to see, it is incumbent on us to listen to the children and young people with autism, to listen to their parents and families, and to listen to the professionals like Anya, who are working so hard to deliver the very, very best in schools in Liverpool and indeed in schools around the country.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm proud to be a Vice Chair of the All-Party Group on Autism, and also to have served as a Governor at a special school in Dudley with a particular focus on autism and Asperger's. 10 years after our Right Honourable friend for Cheshire and Amersham steered the Autism Act through this House as a private member's bill, it's a good time to reflect on all that has been achieved, but also all that still needs to be done to truly deliver on the promise of that legislation to improve support and services for people with autism and for their families. But in the time available, I will focus on just some of the issues, particularly relating to children with autism. As the Right Honourable gentleman said, nearly 5 years after the Children and Families Act became law, progress on implementing the new SEND system is still, well, patchy at best across the country, with, according to the National Autism Society, 42% of families being refused education, health and care assessments when they were first requested, and more than 70% waiting longer than 6 months for support at school. Now, in Dudley, as of January 2018, there were 825 pupils in Dudley's special schools. This compares with, according to the DFE, 119,910 pupils in state-funded schools in England, primarily due to autistic spectrum disorder. But of these, more than 70% were being educated in mainstream schools. This has huge implications for teachers, and particularly for teacher training. And that's why it's so important that since 2016, the new teacher training framework made supporting children with special educational needs, but particularly autistic children, a core part of initial teacher training. That training and that support really does need to be stepped up so that everybody can be confident that every classroom teacher in every school up and down the country is competent and is confident working with children with autism. Because all of those teachers, if they don't currently have a child with autism in their class, well, they will at some point, probably very soon, within the career. And the issues of working with, supporting and educating autistic children are very, very real. It's already been reflected, I think, by my honourable friend for Bexhill, that the behaviour of children can be perceived incorrectly. Often children on the autistic spectrum can find themselves being chastised for not behaving in exactly the same way in circumstances as other pupils would. And so by not behaving in the way the teachers would expect, they therefore get punished in a way that may be appropriate for the class as a whole, but is completely inappropriate given the special educational needs and medical condition of the particular children. And figures from the government show that, indeed, autistic pupils are 4 times more likely to be excluded from school compared to pupils who have no special educational needs. Clearly, there's an ongoing debate on the impact of exclusions, but there can be no debate that such levels of exclusions, far more likely to be excluded, has a severe impact on the life chances of children whose life chances are already impacted by their medical condition. And that's most obvious in opportunities for future work and for training. In many cases, the government is making good progress on the target that's already been referred to in this debate of getting 1 million more disabled people into work. However, the employment gap for people with autism is far wider. Just 16% of autistic adults being in full-time work. And that's why it is absolutely essential that Job Centre Plus staff and work coaches have the proper understanding of autism, and that employers have the full range of support and advice that they need to confidently employ autistic people. I will conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have in previous similar debates, just reflecting on the words of Natalie, who was one of the parent governors at the school where I was governor. Her son, Will, attended the school. And Natalie said of Will, autism is only a small fraction of our son. It is not everything he is. Will is so much more than the label this society has given him. We want him to be accepted, and for him to be accepted equally as a citizen of this country as his peers are. Now, this is what all parents want for their children. And so in this 10th anniversary year of the Autism Act, we all have a particular responsibility to do all that we can to make that wish a reality.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Dudley South, and I also pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Chesham and Amersham for all of her work on this issue over the past decade, and send my best wishes to her and her family at this difficult time. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle on bringing this debate in her absence. My interest in autism comes from the many constituents who've had cause to contact me because they have autism or have a child or family member with autism, and because they have faced a battle to secure the support and access to services they need. It is too often the case that autistic people and their families face significant battles over a long period of time and across a range of public services, including education, health, housing and the welfare and benefit system. I've supported many families who've had to battle for assessment and diagnosis, and often, even when they succeed in gaining a diagnosis, have not received additional support. I've helped constituents with autism who are struggling to access the benefits they need because DWP assessment processes are simply not fit for purpose for people with autism. And most heartbreakingly of all, I've supported constituents whose loved ones are in institutions, long-term hospital care and in one case supported housing, where their needs are not being met and where in fact they have suffered abuse and neglect. Autism is not a learning disability, it is not an illness, it is a form of neurodiversity. And I'd like to commend the work that is taking place in my own party by neurodivergent Labour, who are working to ensure policy commitments to create a society which works for everyone living with autism and other forms of neurodiversity. Autistic people often have very special gifts and talents, like the young man who spent time doing work experience in my office after his GCSEs last summer, who completed the most brilliant analysis of crime statistics in my constituency I have ever seen. But my experience is that autistic people are too often being let down across many public services because schools are often not well enough equipped to meet their needs, because health services are not arranged so as to be accessible, and because there is insufficient supported housing in small community settings, so far too many children and adults with autism are still in long-term hospital accommodation. We must call out the impact of austerity on school provision for children with autism. Teaching assistants have a vital role to play in providing additional support in the classroom for children with autism to help shape curriculum content which meets their needs and to help explain and mediate to manage anxiety. Schools which are being forced under this government to make teaching assistants redundant will run a greater risk of failing their students with autism. Understanding that challenging behaviour in people with autism is often a symptom of anxiety, not a sign of misbehaviour, and that the route to addressing it lies in de-escalating and managing fear and anxiety, rather than in greater discipline, would be transformative in the classroom and prevent many exclusions. The government has introduced new training in autism awareness for trainee teachers, but there is a huge knowledge gap in the existing workforce, which needs to be addressed with properly resourced training for both existing teachers and support staff. Austerity is also contributing to increased difficulty with diagnosis and increased difficulty accessing support post-diagnosis. We know that many local authorities are being forced to raise the threshold for support because across both children's and adult social services, they are struggling to discharge even their basic statutory responsibilities. We need additional resources to be put into diagnosis and post-diagnosis support. It has long been reported that there is a very significant underdiagnosis of autism in women and girls. There is now also emerging evidence that for far too many women and girls, diagnosis of autism takes place only after they have been admitted to hospital due to severe mental illness, whether an eating disorder, depression or an attempt to take their own life. This is simply unacceptable, and I'd like to ask the Minister today what practical action she is taking to address underdiagnosis in women and girls, to prevent a lack of support to live well with autism, resulting in an unnecessary deterioration in mental health. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been an astonishing 8 years. It is astonishing that 8 years on from Winterbourne View, and with transforming care due to end imminently, we are still living with the scandal of people with autism, learning disability or both, living in long-term hospital accommodation, where we know that far too many of them are still subject to human rights abuses, including prone restraint and neglect. This government has failed to implement transforming care. There is no denying it and no escaping it. Private psychiatric hospitals, which are no place for any young person with autism to be living, have been allowed to expand at huge cost to the public purse, while there's been paltry investment in delivering community-based supported housing in which we know people with autism can thrive. Will the Minister commit renewed funding to deliver transforming care today? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents Isabel and Robin Garnett, whose son Matthew I've mentioned many times in this chamber, following his detention under the Mental Health Act in St Andrews Hospital, Northampton, where he suffered appallingly, have launched a new campaign this week. #Human2 is a campaign to give visibility to people living with autism in our communities and against the abuse and neglect that far too many have suffered. Such a campaign should not be needed, but shamefully it is. Can I ask the Minister today to support this campaign, not just with words, but with meaningful action to ensure that every person living with autism has access to the support, services and understanding they need to live well and to fulfil their talents and potential in our communities?
Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an absolute pleasure to follow on from the Honourable Lady for Dulwich and West Norwood, more so because she opened with a phrase that autism is about neurodiversity. And I speak in my, I don't think it should be probably listed in my members' interests as I talk about it so often. I have a son who is about to turn 20, who is diagnosed with Asperger's and who's in his first year at university now and thriving, precisely because he had the great fortune and indeed the personal courage to have teachers in his mainstream schools who took the time to learn about how they could help him stay in mainstream school and have proved that it is possible, absolutely possible, for those young, mostly young men, but some young women too, to make it to adulthood where there is a chance for them to thrive and be everything that they are born to be. But I would like to raise just 3 issues today, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first is this question of autism being a mental health disorder. It is classified in the DSM, the 5th version, which is an American diagnostic tool which is used globally, that this is a mental health disorder. This is simply wrong, and I do feel that the government needs to be taking on the global network of conversation that says this is an acceptable way to do it. I have a particular beef, as everyone knows, that mental health is not what we should call it. Mental ill health is where medicine needs to come in and support people. Mental health is something we all have every day of the week. Sometimes it's in good order, sometimes it's not in such good order. But mental ill health is something specific, and those who are autistic do sometimes suffer from mental ill health, indeed, because of the pressures that are put upon them, because of the situations they're in, which they find too difficult to cope with. But they are not suffering from mental ill health by being autistic. So please, would the government do more to take on this international classification, which is simply wrong and drives all the wrong outcomes? The reality is that the visible symptoms are difficulty with social interaction, indeed a lack of interest in social interaction. There's some really interesting work going on at Stanford University School of Medicine at the moment, researching why this might be. And there's a particular brain pathway called, let me see if I can get it right, the mesolimbic reward pathway, which, if it's well stimulated, is where it comes from enjoying social interactivity. And if it's not stimulated young, indeed it can not develop at all. So there's some really interesting work in that space, alongside work identifying the neurological activity between the left and the right sides of the brain. And those who are autistic seem to have very much fewer interactivity between the two sides of the brain, also reducing those sociability skills that we consider to be neurotypically normal. So I would ask that it's really important that we actually tackle this, because if we get that right and we start to classify where autism sits in, the bit of us that isn't like the rest of us, we start to make policy that actually fits those with autistic diagnostics. I'm proud to be a member of the APPG on autism, and I'm working with the Honourable Member for Bristol West on the employment side of things, looking specifically at the military. And I have an unfair advantage in asking the Minister sitting on the front bench to take note of the fact that I'm trying really hard to get the MOD to let me do some work with them to look at why it is that autistic spectrum disorder is an automatic disbarment at the moment from participating in application to the military, in the United Kingdom. I haven't looked whether that's the case globally, but that this is a fundamental failure on our part to identify there are many senior members of our military who are clearly on the autistic spectrum and who are very, very brilliant leaders in their field. We have now, because many more, thank goodness, young people are diagnosed, have listed it as an automatic disarmament, and that should not be the case. We are losing the opportunity for brilliant minds who have the ability to have this extraordinary focus. In some areas of our military policy now, we absolutely need these minds employed for the nation's good. So I would challenge the Minister, if I may, to help me to break through that main building wall and see if we can't get some process there. But I think the third part, the critical part, and I come back to that, like everything, it's preventative, it's at the beginning. If we get this right at the beginning, we can make better progress. The diagnostic system is just not good enough. I paid a very large sum of money to get my young boy, then 8 years old, James, diagnosed through the private system, which gave him and us a tool with which to work. We were very lucky to have great teachers too. But that diagnosis gives parents a sense of power that they can look after their children. So we keep struggling with how to make progress. And I will raise this again. Would the Minister please sit down with me and others to think about how we could have regional diagnosis centres. It's very difficult to ask every single council to have great teams of psychiatrists and healthcare professionals across 150 of them to get it right. Why don't we have regional centres? And when teachers can see in preschool these young children who clearly are not neurotypical, have particular attributes, socialisation issues, and clearly could be autistic, we could send them very early to get a diagnosis, which would then reduce the huge costs which the state is picking up from the, indeed, mental ill health, which often falls out, the issues with exclusion and so on, and indeed, by the time they're 18, often their inability to really interact in a constructive way with society because they have been battered for too long. So please could we consider looking at having regional centres of excellence for diagnosis to ensure that we can scoop up these young people very much earlier than we do and ensure that we can get the very best out of them, because I see many alongside my son who are extraordinary young men and women, and they are going to bring great value to our country. We need to make sure we don't lose any more of these children on the way.
Brennan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Chesham and Amersham, who sadly can't be here because of that family situation, and congratulate her on her speech, and congratulate the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle. I think he'd agree. He proved, as the old song says, there's nothing like a dame. But he did an admirable job, I thought, in delivering her speech, and also in answering the interventions from colleagues across the House. Now, I take an interest in this, as many people do, and honourable members do, Madam Deputy Speaker, through constituency caseworker, and in particular, I focused on the issue of adults with autism. There's often a lot of debate about children with autism, understandably, but those children grow up to be adults, and that's often when many of the difficulties can arise, when that cliff edge comes of children with autism becoming adults. And sadly, very often that does end up with adults with autism coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And in the case of my own constituent, who I won't name for obvious reasons, the trait of many people with autism known as stimming, which is not generally understood by the general population, the repetitive behaviour of some with autism in order to calm a situation, can be misinterpreted sometimes as a criminal action. And in the case of my own constituent, that led to him being arrested on 2 different occasions by the British Transport Police when he became nervous travelling on public transport, and ended up inappropriately in him being cautioned, and that remaining on the record, despite the fact that that caution was later withdrawn in recognition that he hadn't been given the appropriate support that adults with autism are supposed to get when they come into conjunction with the criminal justice system. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think what's been highlighted is travel is also very traumatic for people with autism, and would he join me in congratulating Cardiff Airport on training their staff to support children and adults with autism travelling through the airport?
I would absolutely join her in congratulating Cardiff Airport on that. It's a stressful enough situation for anyone going through an airport often, and going through security and all the things that come along with it. So the fact that Cardiff Airport are doing that is very much to be welcomed. In relation to adults with autism, the criminal justice system, I arranged, along with Lord Bradley, who is a former member of this House and who himself in 2009 issued a report in relation to not just people with autism but other individuals with mental health issues and so on, how they come into conjunction with the criminal justice system. But we, at the end of last year, arranged to meet, along with some of the families of adults with autism, to meet with the new head of the new Independent Office of Police Complaints to talk about the way that the police often deal with adults with autism when they come into contact with them, and often how they deal with the complaints that come afterwards when those adults with autism have been treated inappropriately and not according to the guidelines that were originally envisaged by Lord Bradley back in 2009. And what I want to say to the House is that I think that Michael Lockwood, the new head of the IOPC, is to be given some credit for engaging very seriously with this issue. And there's a seed change in attitude from the new IOPC compared with the former Independent Complaints Commission in relation to this matter. For example, he's agreed to meet with and engage with the families of those who've had cause to complain, and then to raise complaints with the old IPCC and with the new IOPC, and involve them in designing the ways in which the IOPC will respond, and also in recognising that often these sorts of inquiries can be very confrontational, when what's really needed is to get to the heart of the matter and to get to the truth and make sure that lessons are learned and spread throughout the criminal justice system, and in particular in relation to the police force. And one of the things that is being done, which I welcome very much, by the IOPC, and I think should be done in other organisations as well, is recognising that employees in those organisations will often have children with autism or relatives with autism, and can bring some expertise into that organisation when they are interacting with those with autism. And in the IOPC, for example, they recognise there's many members of their own staff who are from families that have experience of autism, and they can bring an expertise within the organisation when looking at cases where complaints are raised in relation to people with autism. So I want to welcome that, and I think that sort of learning is what needs to take place across the police, across the courts, across the prison system, across social service, adult and children's services across the country, across the National Health Service. And although she's not in her place at the moment, my honourable friend, the member for Bristol West, earlier on was talking about what was going on in Bristol. And in the particular case of my constituent and a couple of other families, I welcome the fact that I understand that adult services in Bristol have agreed to review some of the cases that they've dealt with in recent years, with a view to publishing a report, appropriately anonymised obviously, that can provide lessons learned to people right across the country, and that is very much to be welcomed. Now, my constituents helped get together with other families and set up an organisation called AutismInjustice.org, and I do recommend that other honourable members should look at the stories on there about the way in which their families have come into contact with the criminal justice system. Their long-term aims are, and I quote, that criminal justice and care professionals are aware of and follow existing guidelines and policy relating to autistic people in a way that properly safeguards them. And secondly, that these professionals, as well as the general public, understand autism so that autistic people's appearance and or behaviour is not misunderstood and misrepresented in a way that puts them at risk of serious harm. And I think those are very, very laudable long-term aims. So I would appeal to the Minister to engage with those families, engage with that organisation, engage with across government other departments to make sure that government is working in a joined-up way in this. Those of us who've been ministers understand it's not always easy to get out of the ministerial silos that Whitehall imposes upon us. But in fact, government works best when ministers from different departments get together with a common purpose. And surely this issue of all issues, where there's cross-party support in this House, where there's general agreement on what should happen, shouldn't be in any way inhibited by ministers not being able to work together. So I urge the Minister to do as much as she can to work across Whitehall on this issue.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start too by paying tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham, and I'm glad that all our thoughts are with her. In my constituency, I'm very fortunate when it comes to autism. I have numerous institutions that are set up, whether those are charitable or whether those are full-time, as it were. And I have a number of individuals who do a lot for taking forward and examining and doing the research in autism. And I'd like to mention two of those to start. The first is, it's through this that I was introduced to a lady called Dame Stephanie Shirley, whose work in this area is quite phenomenal. She has spent a huge amount of her own money in taking forward research in this area, and she is a complete beacon when it comes to providing a focus for dealing with autism and for being able to show us what to do. The second thing that I'd like to mention is a charity called Music for Autism. Now, this charity was set up using the Orchestra of St John. And the Orchestra of St John uses music to influence the lives of those with autism. And if you've ever seen them in operation, it is a fantastic experience to see how the members of the orchestra just lap up the opportunity to work with those with autism and to help enrich their lives. And that is a great achievement that I think that has been achieved by that. But there are three areas that I too wanted to concentrate on, and the first one is really to follow the Honourable Member for Cardiff West in commenting on the treatment of those with autism in the justice system. There are three areas of that where it needs to be concentrated on particularly. The first is the police, the second is the courts, and the third, prison staff, if it eventually comes to that. And there are only two things that need to be done in order to take this forward in a very big way. The first is to identify those with autism at a very early stage, because as the Honourable Member mentioned, if you can identify people with autism at an early stage, it helps to make sure that we don't end up in a whole lot of disputes at a later stage. And I'm aware that the courts have put a lot of effort into making sure that the courts are autism friendly when it comes to people appearing before them. I'm aware too of a number of prisons that are supporting people with autism, and I hope that that process, which I think is a pilot scheme, will be run out across the prison system, and that we will learn the lessons from that. The second area that I wanted to mention was the issue of education. And a number of people have already mentioned education, but there's a particular aspect of this that I would like to cover. And that is the involvement of people with autism in designing the training for teachers. A number of members have hinted at this, but I don't think anyone has tackled it as boldly as I'm going to do now. And that is to say that I think that the involvement of people with autism in the training of teachers is absolutely essential. There are many ways in which they can provide help and influence on the way in which the training is devised, and all of that will lead to more choice and to pay special attention to the needs of those with autism. And finally, I would just like to comment on the role of autism and jobs. Last year, I was appointed a special envoy for a charity, an autistic charity called SPACE. I'm never very good at acronyms, so I can't remember precisely what SPACE stands for, but it's something like special something or other for those with autism. But the point of it is, I became the envoy for this charity in order to promote the people in this place taking on staff in their office who have autism. And as a way of demonstrating that and showing how this would work, I took on a young man from Hornchurch, as it happened, who had autism. And I took him on enthusiastically, but I have to say that when it came to saying goodbye to him at the end of his period with me, I really regretted that he was going. He'd been an outstanding worker, made an outstanding contribution to my office, and that had been a great experience, not only for him, but especially for me and for my staff. And I do think if we can encourage more of that, we will have a much better way forward for those with autism.
For Henley, and his contribution is always well worth listening to. Can I thank the Backbench Committee for giving us the opportunity to have this debate, and was very happy to be one of those co-sponsors for that. Thank also the member for Bexhill and Battle for setting the scene on behalf of the Honourable Lady for Chesham and Autism, who would have been here only for being detained elsewhere. The NAS definition of autism is one that we set the scene with. Autism is a lifelong disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. There are approximately 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK without the right support or understanding. Autistic people can miss out on education, struggle to find work and become extremely isolated. As an active constituency member of Parliament, every week in my office I deal with and try to help people who have autism and their families, whether it be in benefits, whether it be in education assessments, or whether it be in family issues and family pressures. The National Autistic Society's Too Much Information campaign highlighted that in spite of increasing awareness around autism, there is still a significant lack of public understanding, and there is genuinely. Our research shows that while 99.5% of the UK have heard of autism, only 16% of autistic people and their families think that the public really understands them. Half of the autistic people and their families told us that they sometimes don't go out because they're worried about the public's reaction to their autism. This is certainly true, but I also was sent a link to a few blogs by a parent in Strangford, and I want to read that out because who said, I don't have the words to explain how I'm feeling, but I want to. He sent this through to me. I want to repeat it if I can, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not a warrior mum. I'm not a super dad. I'm tired. I just want everyone else. What everyone else has, time to enjoy my kids without the constant mind-numbing terror of worrying about their future. I don't want to be an activist. No one does. Nobody woke up one day and said, hey, I want to take time and energy away from my family to fight for someone's rights. Plus, I want to feel the positive effects right now. I ain't doing this just because for other people, honestly. I'm doing it so that I too can benefit from the changes. So instead of patting me on the head or shaking my hand or congratulating how selfless I am, help a brother out, give a sister a break, do something definite to help things now for the next generation. Ask me, I have ideas. Otherwise, miss me with the platitudes, please. That's a heartfelt request from one of my constituents. I want to help this fellow who contacted me and who feels like this, and all the parents like him. I believe we have a duty not to offer platitudes about rainbows and sunshine or individually unique snowflakes, all of which are lovely and touch the heart emotionally. We have a duty, I believe, to provide physical support and practical advice, to provide respite for parents who are on the brink of a breakdown, for siblings who feel invisible as they strive to not add worry or concern to their mum and dad because they're dealing with enough. We have a duty, I believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, to provide respite to that child, to introduce them to people outside their circle in a controlled and helpful way. I don't believe that we are fulfilling our duty. Certainly in Northern Ireland, I don't believe we're doing it the way that I would certainly like it to be. A number of families who have children with challenging behavioural problems, children have met the criteria that is required in order to be considered for overnight care. And the issue of overnight care and that help is so important. I've told them they will have to wait several years before they can access overnight respite care. According to the Health and Social Care Board statistics in Northern Ireland for 2014-2015, 4,031 children in need and known to social services with a disability, 1,210 children with a disability who received respite care. There are 10 respite facilities across Northern Ireland. Each is between 5 to 8 beds, which can be used to care for children overnight, but there are over 1,200 children trying to access those beds. I was very pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my previous job in the Northern Ireland Assembly to be a member of the Autism APPG for Autism NI. We had fought that campaign for them over a period of time. And I know the Autism Act Northern Ireland came in 2011 after I had left there. I would have had some input through the APPG into that. And I want to just outline what that autism strategy done very, very quickly in the limited time that I have. The autism strategy for Northern Ireland is 2013-2020. The action plan is 2013-2016. And we pointed and focused upon the issues. Number one was awareness, accessibility, children, young people and family, health and well-being, education, transitions, employability, independence, choice and control, access to justice, being part of the community, participation and active citizenship. All of those things were the focus of where we were in the autism strategy of 2013-2020 and the action plan and the progress report. It's just a pity that we don't have a functioning Northern Ireland Assembly at this moment in time, because those issues would be the remit of that place and not here. They still are, because the Assembly still has the responsibility, although they're not functioning the way they should be. It would seem that we've got to the breaking point, and that concerns me greatly. And it would seem to have we need better to have a preventative scheme in place for the families of those struggling, living the daily autism battle, so they don't have to reach the breaking point. I'm particularly pleased to see the Minister in place, and I know that we will have a very positive response from her. We always do, and I look forward to a response. And I conclude with these comments. Overwhelming feeling that I get is that parents are weary from lack of sleep, weary from fighting the same battles with the child every day, weary from dealing with people's expectations of how their child should behave, weary from fighting to get recognition for their child, to have adequate support in place to reach their potential, weary from knowing that their children are not getting the attention that they need. Minister, they're just weary, and we need more help right now.
Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to get to follow my honourable friend, the member for Strangford, and to have a rare opportunity to hear him contribute to a debate. But it's always well thought out, always passionate, and always structured on behalf of his constituents. And one thing I'd definitely agree with him would be, at some point, getting the Northern Ireland Assembly back up, doing its job again, tackling the issues that it needs to be tackled on behalf of Northern Ireland, because just ramming business through here in a day is not really what any of us want to see. We want to see those politicians elected to serve Northern Ireland serving Northern Ireland. But with that, I'll come to the main substance of the debate. And in starting, I'd pay tribute to the right honourable member for Cheshire and Amersham and the member for Bexhill and Battle, for securing this debate, but also for the passion they bring to this issue. And obviously our best wishes go to the right honourable member with the family situation she is facing. But it is an interesting debate to come to, because when I was about, I think I was 12 when I did it, I sat the Mensa test, the one that does your IQ. And I got a rating on it, and it was a reasonable one. But what was quite interesting, it brought home. Yes, thank you. I'll have the shadow member too. Anyway, the rating of it was, they say it's interesting, you think, but actually you're not that far off the autism spectrum. And a lot of people forget that the dividing line is not very big. And actually many people who will be there will exhibit some traits. We'll see people, for example, those of us involved in politics, and we're going to a talk on it, where someone's very, very interested in politics. Yet when you asked him, which party do you support? Oh, I don't really support a party. But the issue, I love analysing the election nights. All the stats, all the statistics, if you ask them to reel off election results in the local area, it was in Coventry at the time, for the City Council, they could give it absolutely. And it was because that was their special interest. They were very passionately interested in politics, but if you ask them, which party you're thinking of joining with all this interest, the answer was, well, I'm not really into that. I'm into the analysis of politics. That was the special interest. And it is about that real understanding, and certainly for me, what started changing some of my perceptions about people with autism is when I had a volunteer activist who was someone who did struggle slightly socially in certain scenarios. But when we were doing, of all things, a telephone canvassing session with an automated dialing system, this guy was absolutely star, because the rest of us were struggling, the rest of us were finding this sort of process more difficult. He absolutely engaged, because it was pushing his mind to run slightly faster. Well, of course, that's when his mind running slightly faster was the absolute ability of the whole team. And actually then having a script, having what he said, was really someone who was engaging brilliantly with people on the phone, because that was where his ability came out. And actually what would normally be seen as a disability became a huge ability. And it's why I've been very keen then, as the Member of Parliament, that actually we challenge some of the perception, as has been touched on, sometimes what's seen as naughty, but also
of employers being clear with people with autism is about how you support them when they come into employment. Because actually, and I'm doing some work as Deputy Leader of Coventry City Council on this area with a team, was actually one of the things that they'd found was some people had, why had they left a particular job in programming or in engineering? Their skill set was there, their knowledge was there, their strengths were all in that area. And it was because they were struggling with concepts of things like the lunchroom, things like how the office environment was, what they expected, and because that was anything having to do with some of those interactions that everyone else had assumed were quite simple, but actually those perceptions of how they would deal with them were different. And it's, for me, it's why it's welcome that there is support being provided, but certainly we're just hear from the Minister how further she feels we can go, because actually it is about, and not just about doing an employer doing a favour, it's about an employer sometimes bringing in an absolutely unique talent that may be able to address a job in a way that actually, bluntly, most of us in this room would struggle with, but where the way an autistic mind works can actually become a massive advantage in terms of engagement, particularly in IT and tech, areas where we know all too well. I won't give way because I'm conscious we are trying to bring the debate on. But also that means then in schools having the appropriate levels of support. And I do have some concerns in Torbay around some of the issues and funding pressures around higher needs funding. I recognise the government recently gave some extra funding. However, there has been an issue in Torbay, and I don't think we're unique in the fact that some of the smaller coastal unitaries face an issue with a deficit. Not a lot are traditionally lower funded compared to others, which makes it harder to deal with that due to a history of being paired up with larger, bluntly more wealthier counties and how they've been done. And also it's about actually being clear, it's not just about learning, it's also about having fun. I do welcome the fact that there are support services available in the Bay, the ASRUS group that meets at the YMCA in Dartmouth Road in Paignton, because it's not just about providing education support, it's also about providing social support to build skills. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this has been a worthwhile debate. It's certainly one that I've enjoyed sitting through most of it and listening to, and it will be interesting to hear from both front benches what thoughts that they have about how we can ensure that some of these people have absolutely unique talents and some of the greatest minds that have ever been produced on this planet are people who would actually be just on the autistic spectrum or only just below it. And that's where we need to sometimes change the perception that it's not about someone being not, it's not just about someone with a disability, it's someone who may have a unique ability that we could unlock with the right support.
Trudy Harrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to follow on from the member for Torbay, who made many powerful points. Firstly, can I commend my right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham, for securing this important debate ahead of World Autism Week, and also thank my honourable friend, the member for Bexhill and Battle, for his outstanding representation of her in this chamber today. I would also like to commend the All-Party Parliamentary Group report, written in partnership with the National Autistic Society, Autism and Education 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, at this point I would like to make clear my position as a member of the Education Select Committee, as we are also looking into the needs of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. The Autism APPG's report made for some shocking statistics, but the one that really upset me was that fewer than half of the children and young people going to school say that they're happy on the autism spectrum. It goes on to say that the lack of understanding from their peers and their teachers is the main reason for such unhappiness. And the thought of any child or young person not looking forward to their day at school is to me so incredibly sad and utterly avoidable. With better understanding and a coordinated, resourced approach, I will give way.
I don't take that much of the House's time, but has the honourable member had a chance to meet my constituent Deborah Brownson and the extraordinary facilities that she has created through the online autism plan to help parents and children facing difficulties? And if she hasn't, she should, and join in the campaign to get government support for what she's doing.
I thank the honourable member from Barrow-in-Furness, and I have not, but I would absolutely look forward to doing that. So can I task him with the job of connecting us both, and we'll do that together. With almost immediate effect after being elected into this House 2 years ago, the calls for my assistance arrived from families living with autism. They have told me about living with the daily fight, for support, for a diagnosis, for professional advice, for an education and healthcare plan, for the necessary resources to actually carry out the recommendations within the plan, for reasonable adjustments in school, for flexible working arrangements with parents' employers. As one of many parents who responded to my call for information ahead of this debate said, everything is a fight. To get help is a fight. And to find anything that you are entitled to is a fight. And each family I met with said the same thing over and over and over again. Families talk of the agonising wait for a diagnosis in the hope that a diagnosis will bring some certainty and a joined-up forward plan, but all too often it does not. The fact that we in Copeland live in a rural and remote community, it may be expected that self-sustaining groups have formed to support each other. It's what we do. Groups like Shine for Autism, Autism Around the Coombe, the West Cumbrian Autism Society and the award-winning Sellafield Site Autism Support Network have formed out of absolute desperation and also in recognition that there are so many people living with autism that these groups could make a real difference. And they really are. I would like to pay tribute to all the volunteers and parents who selflessly support others. The resilience and concept of helping each other is what makes me so incredibly proud of my community, but really it's not fair or right or sustainable in the long term because the parents I speak to, and I quote, are at the end of their tether. This fight is resulting in relationship breakdowns and mental ill health conditions, in parents having to reduce their hours or having to give up work altogether because of the lack of childcare for families with autistic children. Autistic children are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school for a fixed period than children who do not have any special educational needs. And with just 16% of autistic adults in full-time work, the UK is missing out on talent and much-needed skills for the future. CAMS came up time and time again as being a critical but under-resourced source of help in Copeland and across Cumbria. Too many children and young people are being left without education, without mental health support and without any reassurance of a plan for their future. Madam Deputy Speaker, the member for Chesham and Amersham introduced the bill that became the Autism Act in 2009, and 10 years on, it is recognised that the calls for training of school staff, the reasonable adjustments in schools, and guidance and resources for local authorities to provide the full range of educational provision and support. I am delighted that the Academy for Autism will be opening in West Cumbria in September, and also that the outstanding Whitehaven Mayfield Specialist School will move into its brand new facility later this year too. The DfE has increased the total high needs budget across England from £5 billion to just under £6 billion in 2018, with funding set to rise above £6 billion in 2019 to 2020. There has been much progress. But I would urge the Minister to consider a different approach in rural and remote areas, as we are missing out, our children are missing out, and the country will miss out on the abundance of talent and skills which are so desperately needed. So my call to the Minister is please help me to find a way to better help the dedicated groups in the vital work that they do.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and like other honourable and right honourable members, I want to place on record my sincere thanks and pay tribute to the work of the right honourable lady, the member for Chesham and Amersham, and as others have done, we certainly think of her at this time. I think the honourable gentleman member for Bexhill and Battle did an excellent job in kind of making sure that that speech was on the record, and I think he's done that very proud. It is a pleasure for me to sum up the debate on behalf of the Scottish National Party this afternoon. We've had an excellent debate with 12 backbench contributions, and I think the time pressure that we had, and it's obviously incredibly annoying sitting through these debates and knowing that people are having to pack so much in. And so I hope in future we can have more debates like this. But as I say, we've had excellent contributions from the honourable gentleman, the member for Bexhill and Battle, the honourable lady, the member for Bristol West, the honourable gentleman from North Cornwall, Liverpool West Derby, Dudley South, Dulwich and West Norwood, Berwick-upon-Tweed, Cardiff West, Henley, Strangford, Copeland and Torbay, all of whom have made very powerful speeches, either referring to their constituency casework or their experience with family members, and was particularly moved by the Honourable Lady, the member for Berwick-upon-Tweed, who spoke about our 20-year-old son and the fact that he's thriving, and I know that we would all wish him well. And at a personal level, I want to thank my constituent Aileen Orr, who lobbied me to attend this important debate today. She was quite right to say, and I think that's been backed up today, that there's still not enough knowledge out there about autism, and we know that many people can still be quite ignorant about it as well, and I think that's at a point that we must all reflect upon. So that's why it is so important that World Autism Awareness Week is a good opportunity for us to give this issue the focus that it deserves, particularly in a parliament that's so dominated by Brexit. I think debates like this remind us that there are other issues out there that people want us to be focusing on, and I think there's a lot of unity in here today. Now, as members would expect, I want to just focus particularly on the situation in Scotland, where I believe we've made good progress, but I think there's still a lot more work to do, which I'll come on to. Last year, the Government of Scotland refreshed its strategy for autism, which runs from 2018 to 2021. And I think the review at that point was a good opportunity to listen to people and look at where we need to kind of improve on. And so I'm really grateful to our Mental Health Minister, Claire Hawkey, who just 2 days ago announced a complete review of mental health legislation and autism legislation. I think the Honourable Lady from Berwick-upon-Tweed made the point about that being kind of treated separately, and I think it was good to see that recognised. But some of the themes from that review recognised the need for professionals across various areas to get more training in autism, and I think that's been a point made today. Again, a lot more on work and employment, and I think it was the Honourable Lady, the member for Bristol West, that spoke about the numbers of just 16% of people. So clearly there is a lot more work to be done in terms of getting people into employment, and I very much support the work of Leonard Cheshire, who do quite a lot in that area as well. There are issues around housing, which I do want to come back to later in my speech, and then of course around education because of the presumption of mainstream and inclusion. It just so happened that it wasn't lined up for this debate, but on Monday I had the pleasure of visiting Altmore Park Primary School in my constituency, which is celebrating its 10th birthday this week. But Altmore Park is a language and communications resource as part of the school complex, and they work very, very closely with the school in terms of making sure that the children that attend from Primary 1 to Primary 7 get excellent opportunities. And there was just a real lovely, exciting atmosphere in that school on Monday, and it's such a pleasure to have that in my constituency. But on the issue of education, I know from my own constituency caseload that we've still got a lot more to do to support families, and like many other members in here, I just remain incredibly frustrated about the waiting times, which are often between 1 to 2 years, which I still think is far too high in Scotland. And I want to pay tribute in particular to East End Carers, which is based in Shettleston, or the Happy Club, which is based in Provan Hall. So often it's these voluntary charities that provide that emotional and practical support to families, particularly in that intervening period between getting a diagnosis. Now, part of the reason why there is such a long diagnosis is because of a lack of educational psychologists, which is a major issue that we've got in Scotland. I think there's only one university, I think it's in Dundee, where people can go to train to be educational psychologists. So I would certainly encourage our ministers north of the border to look at that. When it comes to housing, there are also challenges as well. As a constituency MP, I get a lot of... very happy to give way in.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. In relation to psychologists, I think not enough's been done in actual fact for the schools. Given a particular teacher could study psychology. I mean, I know a number of people that actually teach, but they are qualified psychologists as well. Would you not agree with me that's something that should be looked at?
Absolutely. The Honourable Gentleman from Coventry is right to put that on the record. I'm married to a primary school teacher, and although there were certain aspects of her training, teacher training, perhaps around about autism, I think she would probably feel that she definitely hasn't been given enough support. More often than not, she'll be able to say, anecdotally, I think maybe this child in my class might have autism. They've not had a diagnosis yet, so he's right to put that on the record, absolutely. The point I was making about housing is that more often than not, I find a lot of housing associations don't have a proper understanding of autism. Quite a lot of families will come to me and say, I need a house with a garden in order that my child can be able to play safely in a garden. But what I do find regularly is this kind of chicken and the egg situation, which can be quite frustrating as well. I'm very, very conscious of time, and I know that there's a heavily subscribed debate after this, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I want to just round off by saying that fundamentally it is important that autistic people and their families are understood and welcomed within their own communities and can be supported to be as independent and active as they wish to be. So in conclusion, I thank all honourable members who participated in this debate, and I hope that when we debate it next year, we'll be able to come back here and celebrate it in a way that we've made progress, because if there's one thing we've learned today, we've still got a lot further to go.
Shadow Minister Paula Sherriff.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our thoughts are with the Right Honourable Member for Chesham and Amersham today, who is simply a champion for those with autism. And I'd also like to thank the Member for Bexhill and Battle for securing today's debate and for his excellent productive speech, which I think set the tone for a very, very constructive debate this afternoon. And it's a timely debate, not just in advance of World Autism Awareness Week, but also marking the 10th anniversary of the 2009 Autism Act passed under the last Labour government. It put a duty on ministers to publish and regularly review their autism strategy and produce statutory guidance to implement it at a local level. We have heard from a number of honourable members who participate in the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, which is holding an inquiry into the Act's implementation ahead of the Government's review. And I hope the Minister will give us the Government's views ahead of that formal publication, not just on the changes we have seen over the past 10 years, but what more can be achieved in the years ahead. And let me also say at the outset that the whole House, I'm sure, will want to thank the National Autistic Society, Autistica, Ambitious About Autism, and all of the other charities that represent and serve people with autism for the work that they do, the support that they give and the services they provide to all of those people. And I would like to also mention a charity in my constituency, the Whole Autism Family, run by Martin and Anne-Marie Kilgallen in Murfield, who do phenomenal work. They have 2 sons with autism themselves, but the support that they provide to other families is simply phenomenal, and I'm very, very grateful for what they do. So, responding for the opposition front bench, I think it's important to note that although I am the Shadow Minister for Mental Health, autism is not a mental health condition, and I think the Honourable Lady for Berwick made this point earlier on. And I hope we would all aspire to a society where people with autism have as good mental health as the rest of the population. Unfortunately, however, we are very far short of that aspiration. It is estimated that up to 4 out of 5 autistic people develop mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and 4 out of 10 children with autism have multiple mental health problems. In the worst cases, autistic people end up in mental health hospitals, which often and usually aren't appropriate and are sometimes there for extended periods of time. The Transforming Care programme was aimed at tackling that, but we have heard the evidence that it has fallen far short of its aims. The NHS long-term plan also sets a target for reducing autistic inpatients in mental health hospitals by 2023-24. But if we are able to achieve that, there must be an investment in better community mental health support that is appropriate for people with autism. And the need to tackle this has been thrown into stark relief by the appalling cases of abuse of people with autism that have had significant media coverage in recent months. And this was referred to, I believe, by the member for North Cornwall earlier. There are still more than 2,000 people in totally unsuitable inpatient settings when they should be supported in their community. It is not only unconscionable, it is exorbitantly expensive, with the average package costing £3,500 per week. The Government announced last year that they will be asking the CQC to conduct a thematic review into the seclusion of people with autism in inpatient settings, but this will take far too long to tell us what we already know, that these placements should be ended. So will the Minister finally today commit to ending placements in assessment and treatment units and work with her colleagues to provide the kind of community-based support that people with autism deserve? The Minister will also be aware of the call to reform the Mental Health Act, which defines autism as a mental disorder, allowing autistic people to be sectioned without having a separate, treatable mental health condition. And perhaps she can tell us what plans there are to address the legislation as well as provide the right kind of support services. Perhaps the obvious starting point in dealing with support for people with autism is getting a diagnosis in the first place, and a number of members have quite rightly spoken about that this afternoon. The Quality Standard on Autism recommends a maximum 3-month period between a referral to the first diagnostic appointment, and it's clear that that standard isn't being met anywhere near widely enough, with reports of delays of years rather than months, and that is something as a constituency MP that I've certainly experienced in my constituency surgeries. services. When I spoke on this subject a year ago, I noted that we were about to implement new standards on data for waiting times, which had been patchy until then. We are now nearly a year on and should therefore have data for the full first year next month, with publication due this summer. The long-term plan also contained a welcome and specific commitment to reducing diagnosis times, so I hope the Minister will update the House on any early findings when they will publish the final data and their plans to improve. Similarly, we have heard in previous debates about the need for better data on who is being diagnosed. The National Autistic Society found that over 3/4 of those using their adult services are male, and there is a concern that the lack of recognition for women with autism may be partly behind those figures. There are also age effects, given that autism was not a recognised condition when many older people with autism were growing up. In previous debates, the Minister has said they expect GPs to include autism in the primary care register and will be working with NHS Digital to achieve that, and perhaps the Minister could update us on the progress of that today. There are two often significant barriers to accessing the right services after diagnosis. One recurring theme is the need for better training, which the guidance states all staff should access, but the reality sometimes sadly falls short. Last month, the Government launched a consultation on mandatory training, which is welcome, but for this to work, it must be co-designed and co-delivered by people with autism themselves. So could the Minister tell us whether this will be the case, and perhaps more importantly, whether her department will provide funding to allow the autistic people providing their experience to this training to receive a proper wage for their labour? Early intervention services are also key for communication and language skills, which are closely linked to life chance for people with autism. And in education too, as we have often heard this afternoon, it is services for children with autism and other special needs that have been first in the line for cuts. With the Government taking billions out of the schools budget between 2015 and 17, I know all too well the pressure that schools in my constituency are under. And as the vast majority of school budgets are spent on staff, this is the area of greatest pressure. In particular, the support staff, who are often so vital to children with special educational needs, are the first to go. One-to-one support for children, for example, becomes impossible when the money simply isn't there. Thousands of children in England with approved education, health and care plans are still receiving no provision, and that proportion has increased fivefold since 2010. And if we let children with autism down in education, the impact is felt when they become adults seeking employment. And my honourable friend for Bristol Wells spoke with great knowledge about the challenges of employment for those with autism, and there is an urgent need for improved in-work support services for disabled people across the board, and the autism employment gap is even wider than the disability employment gap. Over the last 10 years, there has been no real change in the number of autistic people in full-time work, and the National Autistic Society found that less than a third of autistic adults are in paid work, even though more than 3/4 do want to be in a job. The NES has called for an autism employment pathway, an awareness programme for employers, and targets for getting people with autism into work. And I hope the Minister can tell us the Government's response and address points such as making sure Job Centre Plus staff understand autism, or the call for autistic people in work to be recorded in the labour force survey. Apprenticeships and other specialist schemes could also provide a route into employment with tailored support for people with autism. And perhaps the Minister can update the House on progress implementing the recommendations of the Paul Maynard Task Force, for example, and what steps they have taken to expand the Disability Confidence Scheme. Finally, there are the services aimed not just at people with autism but at the rest of us, to ensure that we are aware and we understand the condition. The research has long shown that most people with autism feel that their condition is not understood. Recently, the National Autistic Society's Too Much Information campaign highlighted that. Only 16% of autistic people and their families think the public understands autism, and half of all autistic people and their families sometimes afraid to leave the home because they're worried about the public's reaction. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the contributions we have heard from members across the House today show just how much more there is to be done to provide the services that people with autism need. I hope that this is a message that the Government has heard, and I hope they will now act on it.
Minister Caroline Downs.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by adding my voice to those paying tribute to our right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham today. It is thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker, to her pioneering Autism Private Members Bill that we now have an adult autism strategy. This year it will be 10 years since that bill passed into legislation as the Autism Act, 10 years during which she has been the most fantastic, steadfast and passionate champion for autism and autistic people. And I think on behalf of the whole House, we all send her our love and our thoughts to both her and her loved one today. I'd also like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Bexhill and Battle, for so beautifully representing her and her words today, and indeed to all the other members who've contributed today, as well as the Backbench Business Committee for selecting this debate, particularly in the run-up to World Autism Awareness Week next month. A number of members have spoken. They have made some excellent points. I will try and get to as many of them as possible in the time allowed, but will write to anybody I miss out. Much progress has been made to improve the lives of autistic people since that first cross-government autism strategy. There is now improved diagnosis, greater awareness. More organisations are ensuring that they make reasonable adjustments. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, 10 years on, it's very clear that there is still so much more that we can do to ensure that public services meet the needs of autistic people. The autism strategy was updated in 2014, but this year we are undertaking a comprehensive review of Think Autism to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. As the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford pointed out, it's so important that young people and their families feel supported, and that's why we want our autism strategy to work for autistic people of all ages, and that's why, working closely with the Department of Education, we'll be extending our strategy to include children, and that refreshed cross-government strategy will be published towards the end of this year. People with a learning disability and autistic people continue to face significant health inequalities. This must be addressed. It's absolutely right that learning disability and autism are both now clinical priorities in the NHS long-term plan. And autistic people must be at the heart of any improvements we make to their care and support. So that's why last week the government launched a national call for evidence to hear the views of autistic people, their families and their carers, as well as health professionals. We want to know what's working, but we also want to know what more needs to be done to transform care and support. In just a week since that call for evidence, we've already had 875 responses, and I would urge honourable members across the House to share our call for evidence in your constituencies and via your social media networks. I'm really delighted, Madam Deputy Speaker, that so many members across the House have taken the opportunity to highlight some of the amazing work and fantastic organisations in their own communities. Autism-friendly communities like those spoken about in Bodmin by my honourable friend from North Cornwall, who indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, wins the prize for the most intriguingly named constituent, Tigger Pritchard. Incredible. Sound like definitely the way to go to support people much better. As many members have said, of course, raising awareness is not enough. It's acting on that awareness that makes a real difference. We recently launched a consultation on mandatory training on learning disability and autism for health and care staff, and will report findings in the summer. For me, Madam Deputy Speaker, the crucial importance of this is that it not only applies to medical professionals, it applies to all health and care staff. For example, we all know that a negative encounter, maybe with a receptionist or a front of house staff, can immeasurably change our own experience or our perception of our services. The Honourable Gentleman for... I also should mention that work's already underway in other sectors, such as education, employment, prisons and transport, to raise awareness of autism and to adjust services to make them more accessible. The Honourable Gentleman for Liverpool West Derby and many others talked about the importance of early identification of autism and timely and accurate diagnosis. No one should have to face a long wait for an autism diagnosis, but we hear far too often that nice recommendations that we wait no more than 3 months is exceeded, and there is a geographical disparity. This postcode lottery must end. So the NHS long-term plan commits to testing and implementing the most effective ways of reducing those waiting times. Critically, we're collecting data to support this, which will be published later this year for the first time, and this will mean that each area can be held to account and action can be taken. My honourable friend from Copeland mentioned how it's not just getting that timely diagnosis that matters, but having the timely information and the support and the services after that. So this summer there will be new and improved guidance for health and care commissioners, a best practice toolkit to improve diagnosis and post-diagnosis services for autistic people. Health Education England are also developing an autism core skills and competency framework for health and care staff and staff in organisations with public-facing responsibilities. And the Honourable Member for Dudley South and a number of other Honourable Members highlighted the particular challenges autistic children face in schools. The Honourable Gentleman from Bexhill and Battle said that children have to fail before they get the support that they need, and that's why including children and young people in the autism strategy for the first time is so important. The SEND reforms that the government introduced were intended to support all young people to achieve their potential in education, and since 2014 we've invested £391 million to help implement these reforms. But we know that there's more to do. We funded the Autism Education Trust to provide autism awareness training for more than 195,000 existing school and college staff, not just teachers but administrators and support workers, and hope that will go some way to helping diagnose women and girls who we know are very, very much underrepresented in the diagnosis statistics. We also know that disproportionate numbers of autistic children are excluded from school. My honourable friend from Dudley South mentioned that, and Edward Timpson is currently reviewing how schools use exclusions and how we better understand why that's the case and what we can do about it. The Honourable Lady from Bristol West and lots of other members highlighted the need to do more to support autistic people into employment. It's a lost opportunity all round that only a relatively small number of autistic people are in work, either full-time or part-time. There she is. Through the Disability Confidence Scheme, we're helping employers to promote the talents and abilities of autistic people. Access to Work has a hidden impairment group to help give guidance to employers. The Honourable Member for Torbay made a point about the huge value of these people in the workplace. My honourable friend, the lady from Berwick-upon-Tweed, told me something I didn't know, that autism spectrum was an automatic disbar from the military, and I will be raising that with the Minister for the Armed Forces, not least because I fear her infinitely more than I fear him. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman from North Cornwall and the Honourable Lady from Dulwich and West Norwood and many others have spoken about some of the tragic cases where autistic individuals haven't received the right care and support in mental health inpatient settings. We're absolutely committed from learning from this and working harder than ever to improve how care and support is provided. Some people will need access to time-limited inpatient services, but this should be as close to home as possible for as short a time as possible, with discharge plans in place. And when people do need to go into hospital, they need to be safe from harm and abuse and should never be subject to inappropriate or restrictive practices. The Honourable Gentleman from Cardiff West and my Honourable friend from Henley spoke about improving the criminal justice system. Police officers are already in the initial police learning programme given training. Many police forces have developed their own, and liaison and diversion schemes are being rolled out with 100% coverage expected by 2021. The Honourable Lady from Berwick also spoke about how autism shouldn't be classed as a mental disorder, and we will be keeping this very closely under review. She makes a very good point. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government's fully committed to improving the lives of autistic people. There is much more to be done. Autism Awareness Week is a great reminder of that, and our refreshed cross-government autism strategy, which will publish later this year, will help to deliver this and will provide the route map for the years ahead.
Hugh Merriman to wind.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for chairing us today. I've heard it said that Parliament is not delivering for the people. Can I send a message and invite everybody here to send a message to people with autism or Asperger's and their families that with the voices from Chesham and Amersham, Bristol West, North Cornwall, Liverpool West Derby, Dudley South, Dulwich and West Norwood, Berwick-upon-Tweed, Cardiff West, Henley, Strangford, Torbay, Copeland, Glasgow East, Dewsbury, Gosport, and I thank the Minister for all of her commitments this afternoon, and many others who intervened, that we understand the challenges that autistic people have to go through every day. We will be by your side. We will do our best to make sure that you have the services that you deserve. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. And I'm sure that the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Amersham and Chesham, will have been very proud of all the contributions to the debate today, and I hope the Honourable Member will send her our best wishes.